Before empires are built, there are only stories. And in the case of the Aztec Empire, the first story is not about conquest or cities or power. It is about absence, a place that no longer exists. A homeland remembered only in fragments, passed through generations not as geography, but as identity. They called it Aztlan, not a confirmed location on any modern map, not a city that can be excavated or fully verified. But in the memory of the people who would become the Aztecs, it was real enough to define who they were before they became anything else. Aztlan was described as a place of islands, water, and separation. A land surrounded by lakes, distant from the world they would eventually enter. And whether it was literal or symbolic, it served a purpose far more important than accuracy. It explained origin. It gave meaning to movement. And it justified survival through displacement. Because the Aztec identity was not built in stability. It was built in motion. According to tradition, the people who left Aztlan were guided by a divine command. A force tied to their god of the sun and war, a presence that would later become central to their entire civilization. They were told to leave behind their homeland and search for a sign. Not just any sign. A specific vision that would mark the place where their future city would be founded. An eagle, perched on a cactus, consuming a serpent. This image would become one of the most recognizable symbols in all of Mesoamerican history. But at the beginning of the journey, it was not a symbol of empire. It was a promise of uncertainty. The migration that followed was not a short journey. It was a long process of movement across unfamiliar landscapes, shaped by survival rather than destination. The people who left Aztlan did not move as a single unified empire. They moved as groups, adapting constantly to new conditions, negotiating with existing societies, and learning how to exist in regions already controlled by powerful civilizations. This is important, because the Aztecs did not enter a vacant world. They entered a world already full of competing city-states, established trade routes, and entrenched political powers. Central Mexico, in particular, was already a complex and competitive environment. Large cities controlled land, resources, and influence. Smaller groups survived in their shadows, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conflict, and sometimes through forced subordination. Into this environment came the migrating Aztec groups. They were not welcomed. They were not immediately powerful. And in many accounts, they were pushed into harsh environments where others did not want to settle. Rocky terrain, swampy land, marginal zones between stronger city-states. But this marginalization became part of their identity. Because survival in difficult conditions forces adaptation. And adaptation, over time, becomes strength. The Aztecs learned to move carefully through political landscapes as much as physical ones. They observed which cities were dominant, which alliances mattered, which conflicts could be avoided, and which could be exploited. They did not build power immediately. They built understanding. Over time, this movement brought them closer to the Valley of Mexico, a region dominated by lakes and surrounded by powerful city-states. Here, the environment itself shaped political life. Water was not just a resource. It was a boundary. It created islands of settlement, separated by canals and shallow waters. And in this landscape, control of land meant control of survival. The Aztecs eventually became associated with the city that would define their civilization. Tenochtitlan. But before it existed, there was only uncertainty. According to tradition, the final destination of their migration was not chosen by strategy alone. It was chosen by prophecy. They were instructed to search for the divine sign, the eagle on the cactus consuming a serpent. This was not just an image. It was a test of recognition, a way of identifying the moment when wandering would end and settlement would begin. For a long time, they did not find it. And in that uncertainty, they continued to move through increasingly difficult environments. Survival required negotiation with stronger powers in the region. Some groups offered protection in exchange for labor or service. Others demanded tribute. Others treated the migrating Aztecs as outsiders to be controlled or displaced. This period of movement shaped something critical in their development. They became familiar with systems of power from the outside. They learned how dominant cities operated. They learned how alliances formed and broke. They learned how tribute systems worked. And they learned how fragile political stability could be when based only on force. This knowledge would later become essential. Because empires are not only built through strength, they are built through understanding how strength functions in others. Eventually, according to tradition, the sign was found. An eagle perched on a cactus, rooted in the waters of Lake Texcoco. This was not a place of comfort. It was not a place of abundance. It was a swampy, difficult environment surrounded by powerful neighbors. But it was isolated enough to allow something new to form. And that is what mattered. The Aztecs did not choose the easiest land. They chose the land where they could exist without immediate destruction. A place on the edge of survival. Here they began the process of building what would become Tenochtitlan. At first, it was not a city of grandeur. It was a settlement of necessity. Platforms were built to create stable ground above water. Structures were raised carefully to avoid flooding. Land was constructed rather than simply occupied. Every decision was shaped by environmental pressure. But in this pressure, something remarkable happened. Constraint became creativity. The limitations of the landscape forced innovation in construction, agriculture, and organization. Over time, what began as a fragile settlement would evolve into one of the most extraordinary urban centers in the ancient world. But at this stage, none of that was visible. Only survival. Only construction. Only the beginning of permanence in a place that resisted it. And beneath it all, the identity of the Aztec people was transforming. No longer wanderers. Not yet an empire. But something in between. A society learning how to turn displacement into foundation. And foundation into future power. The journey from Aztlan had not ended. It had simply changed direction. And what came next would determine whether survival became greatness or disappearance. A city does not begin as a city. It begins as a decision to stay. For the people who would become part of the Aztec Empire, that decision was made under conditions most civilizations would have rejected outright. The place chosen, Tenochtitlan, was not fertile farmland in the traditional sense. It was a lake, a shallow, unstable body of water surrounded by competing powers, unpredictable terrain, and constant environmental pressure. Yet this was exactly what made it valuable. Because in the Valley of Mexico, survival was not about comfort. It was about position. Early settlement in Tenochtitlan required engineering before expansion could even be imagined. The ground itself had to be created. Platforms were built using stone, wood, and packed earth, slowly forming artificial islands above the waterline. Homes and temples were raised to avoid flooding. Canals were carved to manage movement and water flow. And over time, the settlement began to take shape as a structured environment rather than a fragile camp. But none of this happened in isolation. The region was already dominated by powerful city-states. Tenochtitlan did not rise into emptiness. It rose into competition. Nearby powers controlled land, trade routes, and military influence. Among them were established civilizations that viewed the newcomers as minor actors at best and potential threats at worst. This meant the early Aztecs had no choice but to operate carefully. They did not yet have the strength to dominate, so they adapted to existing power structures. They became participants in a political world they did not control. At times, they served more powerful cities as laborers or auxiliary forces. At other times, they acted as intermediaries in trade or conflict. This period shaped something critical in their development. They learned how power worked from the inside, not the outside. They saw how tribute systems functioned. They saw how alliances shifted when pressure increased. They saw how dominant cities maintained control not only through force, but through networks of obligation. And slowly, they began to understand that power was not only military. It was structural. While Tenochtitlan grew physically, it also began to develop socially. Internal organization became more defined. Leadership roles emerged based on both necessity and emerging hierarchy. Not yet an empire, but no longer a loose settlement. A society was forming, one shaped by both external pressure and internal adaptation. At the center of this early development was the need to manage water. Because water was both the source of life and the source of instability. Flooding could destroy structures. Unstable ground could collapse settlements. So the Aztecs developed increasingly sophisticated systems to manage their environment. Causeways were constructed to connect different parts of the settlement. These elevated roads allowed movement across water while maintaining stability. Small bridges and controlled channels improved transportation and communication. And gradually, Tenochtitlan became more connected, more organized, and more resilient. At the same time, agriculture had to adapt to the environment. Traditional farming methods were limited by the lack of stable land. So the Aztecs expanded and refined a method that would become one of their most famous innovations, chinampas. These were artificial farming platforms built in shallow lake areas. Layers of mud, vegetation, and organic material created highly fertile plots of land. Surrounded by water, they were naturally irrigated and extremely productive. This system was not just efficient. It was transformative. It allowed a population to grow in a place that should have limited expansion. Food production increased stability. Stability increased population. Population increased complexity. And complexity demanded organization. As Tenochtitlan expanded, its relationship with surrounding powers also evolved. The Aztecs were no longer just marginal participants in regional politics. They were becoming a noticeable presence. But visibility brought risk. Stronger city-states monitored their growth. Some saw them as useful allies, others as emerging threats. This tension defined much of the early political environment, and it forced the Aztecs to continue refining their understanding of power. They were learning that survival in this region required more than adaptation. It required strategy. Over time, internal leadership began to stabilize into more structured forms. Certain families and groups gained influence through military skill, organizational ability, and religious authority. These early elites were not yet kings in the imperial sense, but they represented the beginning of concentrated leadership. And concentrated leadership is the first step toward state formation. Religious belief also began to take on greater importance during this stage. The Aztecs interpreted their survival not as chance, but as purpose. The journey from Aztlan, the founding sign of the eagle and cactus, and the difficult conditions of Tenochtitlan were all seen as connected. Not random events, but parts of a larger cosmic structure. This belief strengthened cohesion within the society, because shared meaning creates shared identity, and shared identity creates stability in uncertain environments. As Tenochtitlan continued to grow, it became increasingly difficult to separate survival from ambition. What began as necessity slowly transformed into expansion. Not yet empire, but the foundations of empire were forming. Through agriculture, through adaptation, through political awareness, through survival in a competitive landscape. The city was no longer just existing. It was preparing, and what it would become next depended on how it navigated the world of stronger powers surrounding it. Because in the Valley of Mexico, no city rises alone, and no city remains small forever. Power in the Valley of Mexico was never static. It moved between cities like water across the lake that define the region itself. For the early development of the Aztec Empire, this meant one simple reality. Survival in Tenochtitlan was not only about building internally, but about surviving externally. The city existed in a landscape already dominated by established powers. Stronger city-states controlled trade routes, agricultural land, and political influence across the basin. Tenochtitlan, still young and still developing, had to navigate this reality carefully. It could not challenge these powers directly. Not yet. Instead, it learned to exist within their systems. At times, the Aztecs were forced into subordinate roles, providing labor, tribute, or military support to more powerful neighbors. This was not unusual in the region. Subordination was a common survival strategy for smaller groups in a highly competitive political environment. But for the Aztecs, it became something more than survival. It became education. They observed how dominant cities maintained control over subject populations. They studied how tribute flowed from weaker regions to stronger centers. They saw how alliances were formed, broken, and reshaped depending on shifting political needs. And they began to understand that power in this world was not permanent. It was conditional. That realization would later become one of the foundations of their empire-building strategy. Inside Tenochtitlan itself, the settlement continued to expand in both size and complexity. The physical environment still dictated every aspect of life. Water surrounded the city, shaping movement, construction, and agriculture. Causeways became increasingly important, connecting different sections of the city to each other and to the mainland. These raised pathways were not just infrastructure. They were lifelines. They allowed trade, communication, and military movement across a landscape that otherwise would have been fragmented by water. As the city expanded, so did its agricultural systems. The Chinampa system became more refined and widespread. Small, carefully constructed agricultural plots floated on the shallow lake, producing large quantities of food. This method was not only efficient, it was transformative for population growth. Because in most environments, population is limited by land. Here it was limited by innovation. The more the Aztecs refined their agricultural techniques, the more stable their food supply became. And with stability came growth. Mori people meant more labor. Mori labor meant more construction. Mori construction meant more complexity. And complexity demanded organization. This cycle gradually transformed Tenochtitlan from a fragile settlement into a structured urban center. But urban growth alone does not create empire. Political transformation is required. At this stage, leadership within the Aztec society began to shift. Certain families and individuals gained prominence through military capability, religious influence, and administrative skill. Leadership was no longer purely informal. It was becoming institutional. Not yet fully centralized, but increasingly structured. These early leaders were responsible for coordinating both internal development and external relations. Because as Tenochtitlan grew, its visibility in the region increased. And with visibility came attention. Stronger city-states began to recognize the growing potential of the Aztec settlement. Some viewed them as useful allies, others as rising competitors. This dual perception placed the Aztecs in a delicate position. Too weak to dominate, too visible to ignore. This is often the most dangerous stage in the rise of any civilization, because it is the moment where survival depends on diplomacy as much as strength. During this period, the Aztecs developed a deeper understanding of regional politics. They learned that alliances were temporary, that power shifted based on circumstance, and that no city, no matter how strong, could remain dominant forever without adaptation. Religious interpretation also played a growing role in shaping their identity. Their origin story, the migration from Aztlan, and the founding sign of the eagle and cactus were not seen as distant myths. They were active explanations of their present situation. Every stage of their journey was interpreted as meaningful. Every hardship was seen as part of a larger cosmic design. This belief system reinforced unity within the society. Because when people believe their survival has meaning, they are more willing to endure uncertainty. And the Aztecs were still living in uncertainty. Even as Tenochtitlan grew stronger, it remained vulnerable. Surrounded by powerful neighbors, dependent on fragile political balances, and still developing its internal structures. But beneath this vulnerability was something more important. Momentum. The city was no longer simply reacting to its environment. It was beginning to shape it. Through agriculture, through infrastructure, through social organization, through increasing political awareness. Each layer of development brought it closer to something larger. Not yet an empire, but no longer a settlement trying to survive. A society preparing to expand. And in the Valley of Mexico, preparation is often indistinguishable from transformation. Because once a city learns how power works around it, it eventually begins to use that knowledge for itself. And that is where the story begins to change direction. In the Valley of Mexico, stability is never permanent. It is negotiated. And for the early growth of the Aztec Empire, that negotiation was becoming increasingly complex. Tenochtitlan was no longer an invisible settlement on the edge of survival. It was becoming a recognized presence in a crowded political world. And recognition changes everything. Because once a city is seen, it can no longer grow unnoticed. Surrounding powers began to take more serious interest in the Aztec people. Some viewed them as potential allies in regional conflicts. Others as rising threats that needed to be controlled before they became dangerous. This dual perception placed the Aztecs in a politically unstable position. Too weak to dominate. Too important to ignore. And this is often the stage where future empires are shaped most intensely. Not through conquest, but through pressure. Internally, Tenochtitlan continued to expand its physical structure. The Chinampa system was refined further, becoming one of the most productive agricultural systems in the region. Food production increased significantly, supporting population growth and urban expansion. More food meant more people. More people meant more specialization. And specialization meant the beginning of structured society. Jobs were no longer limited to survival tasks. They expanded into roles tied to construction, trade, craftsmanship, and leadership. This division of labor marked an important transition. Because societies become more powerful when individuals no longer need to do everything to survive. Instead, they contribute to a larger system. At the same time, infrastructure across Tenochtitlan became more advanced. Causeways expanded, connecting different districts of the city with increasing efficiency. Canals were used not only for transport, but for trade and communication. The city began to function less like a settlement and more like a coordinated urban organism. But growth always comes with consequences. As Tenochtitlan expanded, its demand for resources increased. Food, labor, materials, and political stability all became more important to maintain. This created pressure both inside and outside the city. Internally, leadership structures became more defined. Influence concentrated among emerging elite groups who controlled military power, religious authority, and administrative organization. These groups were not yet absolute rulers, but they were shaping the direction of the society. Externally, relationships with neighboring city-states became more delicate. Diplomacy was essential, but diplomacy in this region was never stable. It shifted constantly based on military strength, economic conditions, and political opportunity. The Aztecs learned to navigate this environment carefully. They observed which powers were rising and which were weakening. They studied patterns of conflict. They adapted their strategies accordingly. This adaptability became one of their most important strengths. Because in a world defined by shifting alliances, flexibility often matters more than raw power. At the same time, the Aztecs continued to develop a strong ideological identity. Their origin story remained central to how they understood themselves. The migration from Aztlan was not viewed as a distant past event. It was a living narrative that explained their present position. Their struggles were not seen as random hardship. They were seen as part of a guided journey. This belief strengthened internal cohesion, because shared meaning reduces internal fragmentation. And the Aztecs needed unity more than ever. As Tenochtitlan became more established, its visibility in regional politics increased further. This created both opportunity and risk. Opportunities for alliances and expansion, but also risks of conflict with stronger neighboring states. At this stage, the Aztecs began to understand a critical political reality. Power in the Valley of Mexico was not static. It was cyclical. Cities rose, cities declined, and dominance shifted over time. No single power could remain supreme indefinitely. This understanding would later shape their own imperial strategy. Because those who recognize cycles of power often learn how to use them. Militarily, the Aztecs were still developing. They were not yet the dominant force they would later become. But they were gaining experience through participation in regional conflicts, often as subordinate or allied forces. This exposure gave them practical knowledge of warfare in the region. Not just tactics, but the structure of war itself. How armies were organized. How tribute was enforced. How victory translated into political advantage. Each experience added to their understanding of how power functioned in practice. Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan itself continued to grow more stable. Its infrastructure improved. Its agricultural systems expanded. Its population increased. And its internal organization became more sophisticated. But stability in this region always carried a hidden condition. It depended on balance. And balance is fragile. Because once a society grows strong enough to be noticed, it also becomes part of larger political calculations. The Aztecs were now entering that stage. No longer invisible. No longer insignificant. But not yet dominant. Standing at the edge of transformation. Where survival begins to turn into ambition. And ambition begins to reshape history. There comes a point in the rise of every civilization when survival is no longer the main problem. For the early society that would become the Aztec Empire, that moment arrived not through sudden victory, but through accumulated pressure. Tenochtitlan was no longer a fragile experiment built on water. It was becoming a city with identity, structure, and intent. And intent is where history begins to change direction. Surrounding powers in the Valley of Mexico had now fully recognized the growth of the Aztec presence. What had once been a marginal settlement was now a rising actor in regional politics. And in a world defined by shifting dominance, rising actors are never ignored for long. At first, interaction remained limited and cautious. Diplomatic contact, controlled trade, occasional cooperation in local conflicts. But beneath this surface-level stability, tension was building. Because the Aztecs were learning too quickly. And learning too quickly in a competitive environment is often perceived as threat. Inside Tenochtitlan, development continued at a steady pace. The Chinampa system expanded further, transforming shallow, lake zones into highly productive agricultural fields. This innovation allowed the city to sustain a growing population far beyond what traditional land-based agriculture would have permitted. Food security reshaped everything. It allowed labor specialization to deepen. It allowed construction to accelerate. And it allowed the city to begin thinking beyond survival. Causeways and canals were expanded again, strengthening the physical integration of the city. Movement became more efficient. Trade within the city became more structured. And communication between districts improved. Tenochtitlan was no longer a scattered settlement. It was becoming a unified urban system. But urban systems create new forms of dependency. As population grows, so does reliance on coordination. And coordination requires authority. This is where leadership began to evolve more clearly. Power in Aztec society was no longer purely situational. It was becoming institutional. Certain groups gained prominence through military leadership, religious authority, and administrative control. These early elites were shaping decision-making processes that affected the entire city. Not as absolute rulers yet, but as consolidating forces. Externally, the political environment remained unstable. City-states across the Valley of Mexico continued to compete for influence, resources, and dominance. Alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate strategic needs rather than long-term loyalty. This constant instability created both danger and opportunity for the Aztecs. Danger because they were still not the strongest power in the region. Opportunity because instability creates openings for those who can adapt quickly. And the Aztecs were becoming highly adaptive. They observed patterns in warfare. They studied political shifts. They learned when to engage and when to retreat. They began to understand that empire is not built through constant conflict alone. It is built through timing. At the same time, the ideological foundation of Aztec identity became increasingly important. Their migration story from Aztlan, the divine guidance they believed they had received, and the founding sign of the eagle on a cactus were not just myths. They were frameworks for interpreting reality. Every success reinforced the belief that their journey had meaning. Every challenge was absorbed into that narrative as part of a larger design. This belief system created cohesion in a rapidly changing environment. Because when external conditions are unstable, internal meaning becomes essential. But meaning alone does not build empires. Structure does. And structure was now beginning to take shape more clearly in Tenochtitlan. Leadership roles became more defined. Military organization became more systematic. Religious authority became more integrated into political life. These elements did not exist separately. They reinforced each other. Military success supported religious legitimacy. Religious legitimacy supported political authority. Political authority supported social organization. And social organization supported expansion. This interconnected system was the foundation of what would eventually become imperial structure. But at this stage, it was still forming, still flexible, still vulnerable, yet increasingly capable. As Tenochtitlan grew, its position in the region became more significant. Other cities now had to account for its presence in their own political calculations. This shift in perception is critical, because power is not only what a city is, it is what others believe it is becoming. And the Aztecs were now being seen differently, not as outsiders, not as temporary participants, but as a rising force. That recognition marked a turning point, because once a society is recognized as rising power, it begins to be treated as such. And that treatment accelerates its transformation. The Aztecs were approaching that threshold, where survival no longer defines action, and ambition begins to take control of direction. The system around them was changing, and so were they. In the Valley of Mexico, power rarely announces itself with certainty. It emerges slowly through shifts that are almost invisible at first. And for the growing society of the Aztec Empire, that shift was now becoming undeniable. Tenochtitlan had moved beyond the stage of emergence. It was now a recognized political presence, not dominant yet, but impossible to ignore. Surrounding city-states began adjusting their behavior accordingly. Diplomacy became more cautious, trade became more strategic, and military attention toward the Aztec city increased. Because in a competitive system, recognition always changes risk calculations. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal development continued with increasing complexity. The agricultural foundation of the city, centered on chinampas, had matured into a highly efficient system of production. These artificial farming platforms allowed the city to sustain a population that would otherwise have been impossible in such an environment. But this was no longer just about food. It was about surplus. And surplus changes everything. Because once a society produces more than it immediately needs, it gains the ability to specialize. And specialization is the foundation of civilization at scale. Within Tenochtitlan, roles began to diversify further. Artisans, traders, builders, administrators, and warriors became increasingly distinct groups within society. This separation of labor created new forms of organization and hierarchy. No longer just survival-based roles, but structured positions within an expanding system. At the same time, infrastructure continued to develop. Causeways connecting the city to the mainland became more refined and strategically important. These elevated routes allowed for controlled movement of people, goods, and military forces. Canals within the city supported transport and trade, making water not a barrier but a network. Tenochtitlan was becoming a fully integrated urban environment. But integration always brings dependency. As systems grow more complex, they become more sensitive to disruption. A breakdown in one area can affect many others. This meant that stability required increasing coordination. And coordination required authority. Leadership structures in Aztec society continued to evolve in response. Influence became more concentrated among elites who controlled military organization, religious ceremonies, and administrative decision-making. These groups were not yet imperial rulers in the later sense, but they were shaping the foundation of centralized power. Externally, the political landscape remained highly unstable. City-states competed constantly for dominance, resources, and influence. Wars were frequent but rarely final. Alliances shifted quickly, often based on immediate advantage rather than long-term loyalty. In this environment, survival depended on awareness. And the Aztecs were becoming highly aware. They observed not only military outcomes, but political consequences. They studied how victors maintained control after conflict. And they began to understand something crucial. War alone does not create empire. Control after war does. This insight would later define their imperial system. Religious belief continued to play a central role in shaping identity and decision-making. The migration from Aztlan, the divine sign of the eagle and cactus, and the hardships of settlement were all woven into a single narrative of purpose. This narrative was not passive mythology. It was active interpretation, a way of explaining why they existed in their current position, and why their future mattered. This shared belief strengthened unity within the society, because unity is essential in environments defined by external pressure. As Tenochtitlan grew in size and importance, its visibility increased further. Other powers now had to account for its presence in strategic calculations. This created a new political reality. The Aztecs were no longer a peripheral group. They were becoming a variable in regional balance. And once a group becomes a variable, it becomes part of every decision around it. This is where transformation accelerates. Because external recognition forces internal adaptation. The Aztecs began to refine their military organization. Experience gained through participation in regional conflicts allowed them to understand the structure of warfare in the Valley of Mexico more deeply. Not just how battles were fought, but how political outcomes were shaped by them. They learned that victory had to be converted into influence. Otherwise, it meant nothing. At the same time, internal cohesion strengthened as external pressure increased. This is a common pattern in early state formation. Pressure from outside forces strengthens identity inside. And stronger identity enables more coordinated action. Tenochtitlan was now operating in this dynamic, becoming more structured internally, more visible externally, and more confident in its position, but still not yet dominant, still dependent on balance, still vulnerable to the shifting politics of the region. Yet the direction of change was no longer uncertain. It was becoming clear. The society was moving from adaptation toward expansion, from survival toward strategy, from presence toward power. And once that transition begins, it rarely reverses. By this stage, change in the Valley of Mexico was no longer something the Aztecs were simply responding to. It was something they were beginning to shape. The society that would become the Aztec Empire had entered a new phase of development, one defined not by survival, but by increasing influence. Tenochtitlan was no longer just a growing city. It was becoming a political force that others had to calculate into their decisions. And in a world built on shifting dominance, that recognition was the first real step toward empire. Surrounding city-states adjusted accordingly. Some strengthened alliances to counterbalance the rising Aztec presence. Others considered cooperation, seeing potential advantage in alignment. And some prepared defensively, treating the Aztecs as a future threat. This shift in perception mattered as much as any military action. Because power in this region was not only measured in conquest, it was measured in expectation. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal systems continued to grow more structured. The agricultural foundation based on Chinampers reached a level of high productivity that allowed the city to support a large and expanding population. This surplus did more than feed people. It changed the entire structure of society. Because surplus creates time, and time allows specialization. Within the city, roles became increasingly defined. Warriors trained for combat rather than subsistence. Artisans focused on production of goods. Merchants developed long-distance trade relationships. Religious leaders expanded ceremonial systems that reinforced social cohesion. And administrators began organizing the growing complexity of urban life. Tenochtitlan was no longer a simple settlement adapting to its environment. It was becoming a coordinated system of interdependent roles. But coordination also creates hierarchy. As society becomes more complex, decision-making tends to concentrate. Certain groups began to emerge with greater influence over military, religious, and political matters. These early elites did not yet rule as emperors in the later sense. But they were centralizing authority in ways that would later make imperial control possible. Externally, warfare in the region remained constant, but increasingly structured. City-states continued to compete for dominance, resources, and influence. But conflict was no longer random. It followed patterns shaped by alliances, tribute systems, and long-standing rivalries. The Aztecs observed this carefully. They did not rush into full-scale dominance. Instead, they studied the rhythm of regional conflict. When wars began, how alliances formed, how power shifted after victory, and how tribute reinforced control. This learning process was essential, because early expansion is not about force alone. It is about understanding systems well enough to use them. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society strengthened further. The migration narrative from Aztlan, the divine sign of the eagle and cactus, and the hardships of early settlement were not treated as distant mythology. They functioned as a shared framework for understanding identity and purpose. This narrative explained their place in the world. It explained their struggles, and it justified their survival in a competitive environment. Shared meaning became a stabilizing force, and stability allowed for expansion of ambition. Tenochtitlan itself continued to develop physically and politically. Infrastructure improved, connecting districts more efficiently through canals and causeways. Movement within the city became smoother. Trade became more organized, and communication between different sectors of society became more effective. This increasing integration marked an important transition. The city was no longer just growing. It was becoming systematized. Externally, recognition of Aztec potential increased further. Neighboring powers could no longer treat them as temporary or marginal. They had become a consistent presence in regional calculations. And that alone altered the political environment. Because once a society is consistently accounted for, it begins to influence decisions beyond its immediate actions. It becomes part of the structure of power itself. The Aztecs were approaching that threshold, where presence becomes influence, and influence begins to shift into authority. But at this stage, nothing is yet fixed. Everything remains in motion. Alliances are still flexible. Power is still contested. And the future empire is still forming beneath the surface of regional politics. What comes next will determine whether Tenochtitlan remains one city among many, or becomes the center of something far larger. In the Valley of Mexico, power does not announce itself with a single moment of change. It accumulates, slowly, quietly, inevitably. And for the society developing into the Aztec Empire, that accumulation was now becoming visible in every direction. Tenochtitlan had reached a new stage. It was no longer simply surviving within a competitive environment. It was beginning to influence that environment. This shift did not come from sudden conquest or dramatic expansion. It came from stability. A city that can consistently feed itself, organize itself, and defend itself becomes something other powers must account for. And in the Valley of Mexico, accounting for another city means adjusting your entire political strategy. Surrounding city-states began to reassess their relationships with the growing Aztec presence. Some sought closer ties, hoping to benefit from cooperation. Others distanced themselves, wary of future competition. And some quietly prepared for conflict that had not yet arrived. This was the invisible phase of empire formation. Not war, not conquest, but perception. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal development continued to deepen. The agricultural system, based on chinampas, had reached a level of efficiency that supported sustained population growth. This was not just a technical achievement. It was a structural one. Because food security is the foundation of political stability. With reliable food production, fewer resources were required for survival management. This allowed society to expand into more specialized roles. Warriors became more formally trained. Artisans developed more advanced production techniques. Merchants expanded trade networks across regions. Religious leaders strengthened ceremonial systems that reinforced unity. And administrative groups began coordinating increasingly complex urban organization. Tenochtitlan was becoming a layered society, each layer dependent on the others. And interdependence always increases complexity. Complexity, in turn, requires coordination. And coordination naturally leads to hierarchy. Within Aztec society, leadership structures became more clearly defined during this stage. Influence concentrated among elites who controlled military capability, religious authority, and administrative organization. These groups were not yet imperial rulers in the later sense, but they were shaping the structure of power itself. Externally, warfare across the region continued in cycles. City-states fought, formed alliances, and broke agreements in a constant rotation of conflict and cooperation. But what changed during this period was not the existence of war. It was its meaning. War was no longer just territorial. It was political. Victory was used to secure tribute, influence, and strategic advantage rather than simple destruction. The Aztecs observed this carefully. They studied not only battles, but outcomes. Not only who won, but what happened after victory. And this distinction became essential. Because in this environment, winning a battle meant little without controlling its consequences. At the same time, ideological identity within Aztec society continued to strengthen. The migration from Aztlan, the divine guidance of their journey, and the founding sign of the eagle and cactus became increasingly central to how they understood their position in the world. This was not static mythology. It was active interpretation of reality, a way of connecting past, present, and future into a single narrative. This narrative reinforced unity during uncertainty. And unity is what allows societies to scale beyond their original limits. Tenochtitlan itself continued to grow in both size and organization. Infrastructure became more integrated, with causeways and canals improving movement across the city. Trade became more structured, communication more efficient, and governance more coordinated. This transformation marked a critical shift. The city was no longer just expanding. It was organizing itself as a system. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence continued to increase. Other city-states could no longer ignore them in political calculations. Even if they were not yet the dominant force, they were now part of the regional balance of power. And once a society becomes part of that balance, it begins to influence outcomes beyond its immediate reach. This is the threshold where political presence becomes strategic importance. And the Aztecs were now standing on that threshold. Still not an empire, still not dominant, but no longer marginal. The direction of change was now clear. Internal systems were strengthening. External recognition was increasing. And political awareness was deepening. Everything was moving toward greater structure. And greater structure always leads toward transformation. What remains uncertain is not whether change will happen, but how far it will go. There are moments in history where nothing appears to change on the surface, yet everything beneath it shifts. This was the stage now reached by the society forming into the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan was stable, but stability in the Valley of Mexico is never neutral. It is competitive. The city was no longer struggling to survive, nor was it yet dominating its environment. Instead, it existed in a tense equilibrium with surrounding powers. And equilibrium is always temporary. Other city-states had fully adjusted their expectations. The Aztecs were no longer seen as newcomers. They were seen as a permanent factor in regional politics. This shift in perception had consequences. Because once a society is treated as permanent, it begins to be treated strategically. Alliances were reconsidered. Trade relationships were recalculated. Military planning began to account for future Aztec behavior, not just present conditions. Tenochtitlan had entered the mental map of the region. Inside the city, internal organization continued to deepen. The agricultural foundation, based on Chinampas, had reached full integration into urban life. Food production was no longer just a means of survival. It was a managed system of surplus. And surplus is what separates settlement from civilization at scale. With consistent food supply, population growth stabilized and expanded. This allowed the city to diversify its internal structure further. Labor specialization became more pronounced. Warriors trained within structured ranks. Craftsmen developed more refined production systems. Merchants expanded exchange networks. Religious leaders formalized ceremonial cycles that reinforced political cohesion, and administrators coordinated the increasing complexity of daily urban life. Tenochtitlan was no longer a collection of activities. It was becoming a coordinated system. And systems require structure to function. This structure came in the form of increasingly defined leadership roles. Influence within Aztec society began to concentrate among groups that controlled three key areas: military strength, religious authority, and administrative organization. These were not yet absolute rulers in the imperial sense, but they were shaping the direction of the society's evolution. Externally, the political environment remained highly volatile. City-states continued to compete for dominance, resources, and influence across the Valley of Mexico. Wars were frequent, but rarely decisive in isolation. Instead, they functioned as part of a continuous cycle of shifting power. The Aztecs observed this pattern closely. They learned that military action alone was not sufficient to create lasting control. What mattered was what followed: control of tribute, control of alliances, control of political consequences. This understanding would later become central to their imperial strategy. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society became increasingly important. Their origin narrative, migration from Aztlan under divine guidance, marked by the eagle and cactus, served as more than a mythological account. It functioned as a framework for interpreting reality. It explained hardship. It justified survival. And it provided direction for future action. In uncertain environments, shared meaning becomes a form of stability. And stability enables expansion. Tenochtitlan itself continued to grow more integrated. Causeways and canals improved internal movement and external connections. The city became more efficient in communication, trade, and coordination. This increasing integration marked a critical phase in its development. It was no longer simply growing outward. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence continued to solidify. Other powers could no longer treat them as temporary or marginal. They had become a consistent element in regional calculations. And in political systems, consistency creates influence. Even without dominance, a consistent presence shapes decisions. The Aztecs were now influencing the behavior of others simply by existing at scale. This is one of the most important transitions in state formation. When a society moves from reacting to being reacted to, from being shaped by its environment to shaping how others respond to it. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not an empire. But they were no longer a peripheral society either. They were positioned within the structure of regional power itself. And that position came with both opportunity and risk. Because once a society becomes influential, it also becomes a target of calculation. And calculation is the beginning of political transformation. Everything was now moving toward a more structured system of power. And what happens next will determine whether that structure remains balanced or becomes something far more centralized. At some point, a society stops being defined by where it is and starts being defined by what it can do. For the developing Aztec Empire, that transition was now becoming visible in every layer of life. Tenochtitlan was no longer just a growing settlement or a politically aware city. It was becoming a system capable of sustained expansion. And systems that can expand rarely stay still. By this stage, surrounding powers had fully adjusted to the reality of Aztec presence in the Valley of Mexico. The city was no longer treated as an emerging group. It was treated as a long-term actor in regional politics. And that meant every decision around it began to change. Alliances were evaluated with future conflict in mind. Trade routes were reconsidered for strategic safety. Military planning increasingly accounted for the possibility of Aztec expansion. Tenochtitlan had become part of the regional equation, not as a dominant force yet, but as a variable that could no longer be ignored. Inside the city, internal development continued to deepen and stabilize. The agricultural system, based on chinampas, had reached a level of efficiency that supported sustained urban growth. This was not simply about feeding people anymore. It was about producing surplus consistently enough to support specialization across society. And specialization is where complexity begins. As food supply stabilized, population growth allowed for more defined social roles. Warriors became more systematically trained. Craftsmen focused on specialized production. Merchants expanded trade activity across wider regions. Religious leaders developed more structured ceremonial cycles. And administrators coordinated the increasing demands of urban life. Tenochtitlan was no longer a loose network of activities. It was becoming a coordinated structure of interdependent systems. And interdependence always increases the need for organization. This is where leadership began to evolve more clearly. Influence within society concentrated among groups that controlled three essential pillars: military capability, religious authority, and administrative coordination. These groups were not yet absolute rulers in the imperial sense, but they were shaping the framework within which future empire would operate. Externally, the Valley of Mexico remained highly competitive. City-states continued to rise and fall in influence through cycles of war, alliance, and trade. Conflict was not an exception. It was a constant condition of political life. But what was changing was how conflict was understood. War was no longer just destruction. It was a tool of negotiation between powers. Victory created obligations. Defeat created dependency. And both outcomes fed into broader political systems. The Aztecs observed this pattern carefully. They began to understand that military success alone was insufficient. What mattered was conversion of success into long-term influence. Control after conflict became more important than conflict itself. This understanding would later define the structure of their empire. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society continued to strengthen. Their origin story from Aztlan, the divine instruction to search for a specific sign, and the founding of Tenochtitlan were not viewed as distant mythology. They functioned as an active framework for interpreting their world. Every success reinforced the belief that their journey had purpose. Every hardship was integrated into a larger narrative of meaning. This shared interpretation created internal stability. And stability is essential for any society attempting to grow beyond its original limits. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve physically. Infrastructure expanded, improving internal connectivity through canals and causeways. Movement became more efficient. Trade more organized. Communication more structured. And governance more coordinated. The city was no longer simply expanding outward. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become permanent. Other powers could not remove them from political calculations. Even without dominance, they were now embedded in the structure of regional power. And once a society becomes structurally embedded, it begins to influence outcomes indirectly. Decisions are made with it in mind. Strategies are adjusted around its existence, and expectations are shaped by its potential. This is where influence becomes systemic, and systemic influence is the foundation of empire. The Aztecs were now standing in that space, not yet controlling the system, but no longer outside it. Everything was moving toward consolidation, toward definition, toward a clearer structure of power. And once that structure forms, history begins to accelerate. When a society begins to understand its own strength, it stops behaving like something temporary. It starts behaving like something inevitable. For the developing Aztec Empire, that shift was becoming increasingly visible. Tenochtitlan was no longer just a successful city in a competitive region. It was becoming a stabilizing force within that competition. And in the Valley of Mexico, stability is rarely allowed to remain uncontested. Surrounding city-states had now fully integrated the Aztec presence into their political thinking. The city was no longer evaluated as an emerging settlement. It was evaluated as a permanent actor. And permanence changes strategy. Some powers began seeking stronger alliances, hoping to secure advantage through cooperation. Others reinforced defensive positions, anticipating future conflict. And others continued balancing between both approaches, unsure of how the system would ultimately shift. But all of them now operated with one shared assumption. The Aztecs would matter. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal systems continued to evolve with increasing precision. The agricultural foundation, based on chinampas, had reached a level of stability that allowed long-term planning. Food production was no longer uncertain. It was reliable. And reliability is what allows complexity to expand without collapse. As surplus became consistent, social organization deepened further. Labor specialization became more distinct. Warriors developed structured ranks and training systems. Craftsmen refined techniques and tools. Merchants expanded long-distance trade networks. Religious leaders coordinated increasingly elaborate ceremonial cycles. And administrators managed the growing demands of urban coordination. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply functioning. It was being organized. And organization always leads toward hierarchy. Within this growing structure, leadership influence became more concentrated among groups that controlled military force, religious authority, and administrative decision-making. These were not yet imperial rulers in the later sense, but they were shaping the structure that made empire possible. Externally, the political environment remained highly unstable. City-states continued to compete for dominance across the Valley of Mexico. Power shifted frequently through cycles of alliance and conflict. But what was changing was the interpretation of those cycles. War was no longer seen only as destruction. It was seen as a mechanism for restructuring influence. Victories created obligations. Defeats created dependencies. And both outcomes reinforced broader systems of control. The Aztecs studied this carefully. They observed not just who won battles, but what those victories produced afterward. And they began to internalize a key principle. Military success is only meaningful if it produces political control. This insight would later become central to their expansion. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society strengthened further. Their origin narrative, from Aztlan, guided by divine instruction, culminating in the founding sign of the eagle and cactus, remained central to identity. This was not passive storytelling. It was active structure, a way of organizing experience into meaning. It explained hardship. It validated survival. And it gave direction to future ambition. In uncertain environments, shared meaning becomes a form of stability stronger than physical security. Tenochtitlan itself continued to expand in both size and coordination. Infrastructure improvements enhanced internal connectivity. Canals supported movement and trade. Causeways linked districts and surrounding regions. The city became increasingly efficient in its internal organization. This efficiency marked a critical transition. Tenochtitlan was no longer just growing. It was synchronizing. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had now become irreversible. Other powers could not ignore them in strategic planning. Even without dominance, their presence shaped expectations across the region. And once expectations begin to shift, influence spreads beyond direct action. The Aztecs were now embedded within the structure of regional politics. Not as rulers, not as outsiders, but as a permanent factor in the balance of power. This position carried both opportunity and risk, because embedded systems can either stabilize into control or trigger conflict when pressure increases too far. At this stage, the direction was still open, but momentum was no longer neutral. Everything was beginning to lean toward consolidation, toward structure, toward transformation. And once that transformation completes, the system will no longer resemble what came before it. When a city becomes predictable to others, it stops being just a city. It becomes a problem to solve. For the developing Aztec Empire, this was the stage now emerging across the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan was no longer a question mark in regional politics. It was an established reality. And established realities force reactions. Surrounding city-states had fully adapted their strategies to account for Aztec presence. Some pursued cooperation through trade and alliance. Others strengthened military readiness. And others began forming shifting coalitions designed to prevent any single power from becoming too dominant. The Valley of Mexico was no longer just a network of competing cities. It was becoming a system of balance. And the Aztecs were now one of its central components. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal development continued with increasing complexity. The agricultural foundation, based on chinampas, had stabilized food production to a level that supported long-term urban growth. This stability removed one of the greatest limits on civilization: uncertainty of survival. With food reliably available, the city could focus on structure rather than crisis response. And structure is where civilization becomes defined. Labor specialization expanded further. Warriors were trained within more formalized ranks. Craftsmen developed increasingly refined production techniques. Merchants expanded exchange networks beyond immediate regions. Religious leaders organized ceremonial cycles that reinforced unity and legitimacy. And administrators coordinated the growing demands of an expanding urban population. Tenochtitlan was no longer a growing settlement. It was becoming a managed system. And managed systems require hierarchy. As complexity increased, leadership roles became more concentrated among groups controlling military capability, religious authority, and administrative coordination. These groups did not yet form an empire in the imperial sense, but they were building the framework that would allow one to exist. Externally, warfare across the region remained constant. City-states continued to rise and fall through cycles of conflict, alliance, and betrayal. But the meaning of war was changing. It was no longer just about destruction or territorial gain. It was about control of outcomes. Victory mattered less than what victory produced afterward. Tribute systems, political dependency, strategic alliances. The Aztecs began to understand this distinction deeply. They observed that lasting power did not come from winning battles alone. It came from shaping the system that remained after battles ended. This understanding marked a turning point in their political evolution, because it shifted focus from reaction to strategy. At the same time, ideological identity within Aztec society became even more central. The migration from Aztlan, the divine instruction guiding their journey, and the founding sign of the eagle and cactus were not treated as distant myth. They were treated as active explanation, a framework for interpreting the present. Every hardship was given meaning. Every success was integrated into a larger narrative. And every uncertainty was absorbed into a sense of purpose. This shared worldview created cohesion in a highly unstable environment. And cohesion is what allows societies to scale beyond their initial limits. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve physically and structurally. Canals and causeways improved movement and integration across the city. Trade became more efficient. Communication between districts became faster. And governance became more coordinated. The city was no longer simply expanding outward. It was becoming internally aligned. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become unavoidable. Even rival powers that opposed them had to account for them in strategic planning. They were no longer a temporary factor. They were a permanent variable in the political equation of the region. And once a society becomes a permanent variable, it begins to shape outcomes indirectly. It influences decisions without needing to act directly. It alters expectations before conflict even occurs. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant. But they were no longer peripheral. They were embedded within the structure of regional power itself. And embedded systems do not remain static for long. They either stabilize into control or evolve into transformation. And the system around them was now moving toward change. There is a point in the life of every rising power when it stops asking whether it belongs in the system and starts preparing to control it. For the developing Aztec Empire, that point was now approaching. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply adapting to the political environment of the Valley of Mexico. It was beginning to understand that environment as something that could be shaped. And that shift changes everything. Surrounding city-states had long since adjusted to Aztec presence. They no longer viewed the city as temporary or marginal. They viewed it as permanent. And permanence forces planning. Some states strengthened alliances in anticipation of future power shifts. Others reinforced military readiness, preparing for possible conflict. And others continued to balance between cooperation and opposition, trying to preserve independence in a changing system. But all of them now operated within the same reality. The Aztecs were part of the structure of power. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal systems had reached a level of complexity that required increasing coordination. The Chinampa-based agricultural system had matured into a stable foundation of surplus production. This surplus was no longer just supporting life. It was supporting expansion. Because surplus creates freedom from survival constraints. And freedom from survival allows specialization. Labor roles became more distinct. Warriors trained in structured hierarchies. Craftsmen developed increasingly refined production systems. Merchants expanded long-distance exchange networks. Religious leaders coordinated ceremonial cycles that reinforced unity and legitimacy. And administrators managed the growing complexity of urban organization. Tenochtitlan was no longer a settlement reacting to its environment. It was becoming a structured system operating within it. And structured systems require hierarchy. As complexity increased, leadership influence became more concentrated among those who controlled military force, religious authority, and administrative coordination. These groups were not yet emperors, but they were building the architecture of empire. Externally, warfare across the region continued in constant cycles. City-states rose and fell through shifting alliances, conflicts, and betrayals. But what changed during this period was interpretation. War was no longer seen only as destruction. It was understood as a mechanism of political restructuring. Victory created obligations. Defeat created dependency. And both outcomes reshaped regional balance. The Aztecs studied this carefully. They observed not just who won, but what systems emerged afterward. And they developed a crucial understanding. Military strength is temporary unless it becomes political structure. This principle would later define their expansion strategy. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society strengthened further. Their origin narrative, migration from Aztlan, divine guidance, and the founding sign of the eagle and cactus remained central to identity. This narrative was not static mythology. It was an interpretive framework, a way of organizing experience into meaning. It explained hardship. It justified survival. And it directed ambition. In unstable environments, shared meaning becomes a stabilizing force stronger than physical security. Tenochtitlan itself continued to develop in both structure and efficiency. Causeways and canals improved movement across the city. Trade became more organized. Communication between districts became faster and more reliable. Governance became more coordinated. The city was no longer simply expanding outward. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become irreversible. Even opposing powers had to factor them into strategic decisions. They were no longer outside the system. They were part of it. And once a society becomes part of a system, it begins to influence it indirectly. It shapes expectations before action occurs. It alters decisions before conflict begins. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant. But they were no longer peripheral. They were embedded within the structure of regional power. And embedded structures rarely remain unchanged. They either stabilize into control or accelerate into transformation. And the system around them was now moving closer to that transformation with every passing cycle of alliance, war, and adaptation. In most histories, change is described as a moment. But in reality, it is a build-up so gradual that those living through it rarely notice when the threshold is crossed. For the society forming into the Aztec Empire, that threshold was now approaching from every direction at once. Tenochtitlan had reached a stage where it was no longer simply adapting to its environment. It was beginning to define its place within it. And once a society begins to define its place, others begin to respond differently to it. Surrounding city-states had already accepted Aztec presence as permanent. But permanence is not neutrality. It is a signal. Some powers interpreted that signal as opportunity, seeking alliances that could strengthen their own position in the shifting balance of the Valley of Mexico. Others interpreted it as warning, increasing defensive preparations and political caution. and others attempted to maintain flexibility, avoiding full commitment in any direction. But all of them were now reacting to the same underlying reality. The Aztecs were no longer emerging. They were established. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal development had reached a stage of high coordination. The Chinampa agricultural system provided consistent surplus, removing the most basic limitation on urban growth, uncertainty of food supply. With survival stabilized, society could specialize further. Warriors trained within structured hierarchies, developing discipline and tactical coordination. Craftsmen refined production techniques that supported both daily life and ceremonial culture. Merchants expanded trade networks, linking the city to broader regional exchange systems. Religious leaders formalized rituals that reinforced collective identity and political legitimacy. And administrators coordinated the increasingly complex demands of a growing urban population. Tenochtitlan was no longer a growing settlement. It was a functioning system of interdependent parts. And systems of interdependence always moved toward hierarchy. As complexity increased, leadership influence concentrated among those who controlled three essential domains: military organization, religious authority, and administrative coordination. These groups were not yet imperial rulers in the later sense, but they were shaping the structural foundation upon which empire would later be built. Externally, the Valley of Mexico remained a landscape defined by competition. City-states continued to rise and fall through cycles of alliance, conflict, and restructuring. But the meaning of those cycles was changing. War was no longer interpreted only as destruction. It was understood as a mechanism for reorganizing power relationships. Victory created obligations that extended beyond the battlefield. Defeat created dependencies that reshaped political alignment. And both outcomes fed into larger systems of regional balance. The Aztecs studied this environment closely. They observed not only the outcomes of conflict, but the systems that emerged afterward. And they developed an increasingly clear understanding. Power is not defined by winning battles. It is defined by controlling what happens after them. This insight marked a turning point in their political evolution. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society strengthened further. Their migration narrative from Aztlan, the divine instruction guiding their journey, and the founding sign of the eagle on a cactus were not treated as distant myth. They functioned as an active interpretive framework for reality, a way of connecting past experience with present identity and future direction. Hardship became meaningful. Survival became justified. And ambition became structured. In unstable environments, shared meaning becomes a form of stability more powerful than physical safety. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve physically and structurally. Infrastructure expanded, improving connectivity across the city through canals and causeways. Trade routes became more efficient. Communication between districts became faster and more reliable. And governance became increasingly coordinated. The city was no longer simply expanding outward. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become irreversible. Even rival powers that opposed them had to account for their existence in strategic planning. They were no longer external to the system. They were embedded within it. And embedded systems begin to influence outcomes indirectly. They shape expectations before decisions are made. They alter strategies before conflicts begin. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant. But they were no longer marginal. They occupied a structural position within regional power itself. And that position carried an inevitable consequence. Once a society becomes structurally embedded, it must either stabilize into control or transform the structure it exists within. And the Valley of Mexico was now entering the phase where transformation becomes unavoidable. Long before an empire expands outward, it expands inward. Not through territory, but through capability. For the developing Aztec Empire, that internal expansion was now becoming visible in the most fundamental way possible: the ability to feed itself reliably at scale. Tenochtitlan was no longer just surviving in a difficult environment. It was mastering it. And mastery of environment is one of the first true signs of imperial potential. At the center of this transformation was agriculture. More specifically, the Chinampa system. These artificial farming platforms, built in shallow lake waters, had evolved into one of the most productive agricultural methods in the entire Valley of Mexico. But by this stage, they were no longer just an innovation. They were infrastructure, a permanent system that allowed continuous food production independent of traditional land limitations. Surrounding city-states understood this advantage, but few could replicate it at scale. Because Chinampas required not just technique, but sustained organization, labor coordination, and environmental control. And that combination was rare. Inside Tenochtitlan, this agricultural stability had profound consequences. Food security removed one of the most common constraints on pre-industrial urban growth: famine risk. And when famine risk decreases, population can expand more reliably. But population alone does not define development. What matters is what that population can do. With stable surplus, society began to specialize more deeply. Warriors trained within more formal structures, developing discipline and coordination. Craftsmen refined production techniques that supported both everyday life and ceremonial demands. Merchants expanded trade networks, linking Tenochtitlan more closely to regional exchange systems. Religious specialists coordinated rituals that reinforced collective identity and political legitimacy. And administrative groups managed the increasingly complex organization of urban life. Tenochtitlan was no longer a settlement reacting to environmental pressure. It was becoming a system managing its own complexity. And systems that manage complexity require coordination. Coordination leads to structure, and structure leads to hierarchy. As internal organization deepened, leadership influence became increasingly concentrated among those who controlled three essential domains: agriculture-linked resource distribution, military organization, and religious authority. These domains were not separate. They reinforced each other. Control of food supported political stability. Military strength enforced external security. Religious authority legitimized both. Together, they formed the foundation of centralized power. Externally, the political environment remained unstable, but increasingly structured. City-states across the Valley of Mexico continued to compete for influence through cycles of war, alliance, and shifting dominance. But what changed was how these cycles were understood. Conflict was no longer seen as isolated events. It was seen as part of a continuous system of power adjustment. Victory created long-term obligations through tribute and political alignment. Defeat created dependency that reshaped future interactions. And both outcomes reinforced broader regional structures. The Aztecs studied these patterns closely. They began to recognize that raw military strength was not enough to secure lasting influence. What mattered was control over the systems that followed conflict. This understanding would later become central to their imperial strategy. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society became even more important. Their migration from Aztlan, guided by divine instruction and culminating in the founding sign of the eagle and cactus, remained a core narrative. But it was more than identity. It was structure, a way of organizing experience into meaning. It explained their past. It justified their present. And it directed their future. In unstable environments, shared meaning functions as a stabilizing force stronger than physical security. Tenochtitlan itself continued to develop physically and structurally. Causeways and canals improved internal movement and external connection. Trade became more efficient. Communication between districts became faster. And governance became more coordinated. The city was no longer expanding randomly. It was synchronizing. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become permanent. Other powers could not remove them from strategic consideration. Even without dominance, they had become embedded within the regional system. And embedded systems begin to shape outcomes indirectly. They influence expectations before decisions are made. They alter strategies before conflict begins. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not an empire. But they had achieved something equally important. They had become necessary to the system around them. And once a society becomes necessary, it is only a matter of time before it begins to define the system itself. When a society becomes necessary to its environment, it stops being just one participant among many. It becomes part of the system's logic. For the developing Aztec Empire, this was the stage now unfolding across the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan was no longer merely adapting to regional politics. It was shaping the expectations of those politics. And that shift changes the nature of everything that follows. Surrounding city-states had long since integrated Aztec presence into their strategic thinking. But integration does not mean comfort. It means calculation. Some powers now sought closer alignment, believing cooperation could secure advantage in an increasingly complex balance of power. Others reinforced defensive strategies, preparing for future instability. And others continued to shift between both positions, trying to preserve independence in a system that was becoming harder to predict. But all of them now operated within a shared assumption. The Aztecs were not temporary. They were structural. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal systems continued to mature. The agricultural base, built on chinampas, remained the foundation of stability. But by this stage, its importance had shifted. It was no longer just about feeding a population. It was about enabling everything else the society could become. Because once food supply is secure, every other system can expand. And expand it did. Labor specialization became more refined. Warriors developed structured ranks and training systems focused on discipline and coordination. Craftsmen produced increasingly sophisticated goods that supported both practical life and ceremonial culture. Merchants extended trade networks deeper into the region, linking Tenochtitlan to distant markets. Religious leaders organized complex ceremonial systems that reinforced political legitimacy and social cohesion. And administrators coordinated the growing demands of a dense urban population. Tenochtitlan was no longer a developing city. It was a fully functioning system of interdependent roles. And interdependence always produces structure. As internal complexity increased, leadership influence became more concentrated among those who controlled three essential domains: resource distribution, military organization, and religious authority. These domains formed a self-reinforcing structure. Control food, and you control survival. Control the military, and you control security. Control religion, and you control legitimacy. Together, they formed the foundation of centralized authority. Externally, the Valley of Mexico remained defined by competition. City-states continued to rise and fall through cycles of conflict, alliance, and shifting dominance. But what changed during this stage was interpretation. War was no longer understood as isolated violence. It was understood as a mechanism of systemic adjustment. Each conflict reshaped political relationships. Each victory created obligations. Each defeat created dependency. And over time, these outcomes formed a dynamic structure of regional power. The Aztecs studied this system closely. They began to understand that military strength alone could not sustain long-term influence. What mattered was how that strength was converted into political structure afterward. This insight marked a critical shift in their strategic thinking. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society deepened further. Their origin narrative, from Aztlan, guided by divine instruction, culminating in the eagle on a cactus, remained central. But it functioned as more than identity. It functioned as interpretation, a way of turning experience into meaning. It explained hardship. It justified survival. And it directed ambition. In unstable environments, shared meaning becomes a form of stability more enduring than physical conditions. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve in structure and efficiency. Causeways and canals improved movement across the city. Trade systems became more organized. Communication between districts became faster and more reliable. And governance became increasingly coordinated. The city was no longer simply growing outward. It was becoming internally aligned. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had now become irreversible. Even rival powers had to account for them in every strategic calculation. They were no longer outside the system. They were part of it. And once a society becomes part of a system, it begins to influence outcomes without direct action. It shapes expectations. It alters strategies. It changes the behavior of others simply through its existence. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant. But they had crossed a threshold that cannot easily be reversed. They were now a structural component of regional power. And structural components do not remain static for long. They either stabilize into control or accelerate toward transformation. And the system around them was now moving closer to that transformation with each passing cycle of conflict, adaptation, and growth. There is a moment in the life of every rising power when it stops being defined by what others allow it to be, and starts being defined by what it is capable of becoming. For the developing Aztec Empire, that moment was beginning to emerge beneath the surface of everyday life in the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan was no longer just a participant in regional politics. It was becoming a reference point, a city other powers had to measure themselves against, even when they opposed it. And once that happens, the balance of power is already shifting. Surrounding city-states had fully integrated Aztec presence into their strategic thinking. But integration now carried a new tone. Not acceptance, calculation. Some states moved closer to the Aztecs, seeking advantage through alignment in a changing system. Others reinforced independence, preparing for future confrontation. And others continued shifting between both positions, reacting to short-term conditions in a long-term transformation they could not fully control. But all of them now operated within the same reality. The Aztecs were no longer emerging. They were established. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal systems continued to deepen in complexity and coordination. The agricultural foundation built on chinampas remained the core of stability. But its real impact was now fully realized. It was not just feeding a city. It was sustaining a system capable of continuous expansion. Because surplus changes everything. It removes the constant pressure of survival. And when survival pressure decreases, specialization increases. Labor within the city became increasingly defined. Warriors developed structured training systems and ranked organization. Craftsmen refined techniques that supported both daily life and ceremonial production. Merchants expanded trade routes, connecting Tenochtitlan more deeply into regional exchange networks. Religious leaders coordinated ceremonial cycles that reinforced unity, authority, and continuity. And administrators managed the growing complexity of a densely populated urban environment. Tenochtitlan was no longer a settlement adapting to conditions. It was a system managing itself. And self-management requires hierarchy. As internal complexity increased, authority became more concentrated among those who controlled three essential pillars: resource distribution, military organization, and religious legitimacy. These pillars were not independent. They reinforced each other continuously. Control resources, and you stabilize society. Control the military, and you enforce order. Control religion, and you define meaning. Together, they formed the structural foundation of centralized power. Externally, warfare across the Valley of Mexico continued in constant cycles. City-states rose and fell through shifting alliances, conflicts, and recalibrations of dominance. But the meaning of war had changed again. It was no longer viewed simply as destruction or territorial gain. It was a mechanism for reshaping political relationships. Victory created long-term obligations. Defeat created dependency. And both outcomes contributed to a constantly adjusting system of regional balance. The Aztecs studied this system with increasing clarity. They recognized that military success alone did not guarantee power. What mattered was how that success was converted into lasting structure afterward. This understanding became a turning point in their strategic development, because it shifted focus from immediate outcomes to systemic control. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society remained central to its stability. Their origin narrative, from Aztlan, guided by divine instruction, culminating in the eagle on a cactus, continued to define identity. But its function was broader than memory. It was interpretation, a way of organizing reality into meaning. It explained their past. It justified their present. And it shaped their future direction. In unstable environments, shared meaning becomes a stabilizing force more powerful than material security alone. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve in both physical and organizational terms. Causeways and canals improved movement across the city. Trade became more structured. Communication became faster and more reliable. And governance became more coordinated. The city was no longer simply expanding outward. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become irreversible. Even rival powers had to account for them in strategic planning. They were no longer outside the system. They were embedded within it. And once embedded, a society begins to influence outcomes indirectly. It shapes expectations. It alters decisions. It changes the trajectory of others without needing direct action. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant, but they had become unavoidable. And in political systems, what becomes unavoidable does not remain secondary for long. It becomes central, and central systems inevitably reshape the structure around them. When a society becomes unavoidable, it has already crossed the line between participation and influence. It may not yet command the system, but the system can no longer ignore it. For the developing Aztec Empire, this was the position now defining its place in the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan had reached a stage where its presence alone altered political behavior. Other city-states no longer made decisions independently of it. They calculated it into every alliance, every conflict, every negotiation. And once a society becomes part of everyone else's calculations, it begins to gain structural power. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal development continued with increasing precision and coordination. The agricultural system, based on chinampas, remained the foundation of stability. But by this stage, its importance was no longer just practical. It was structural. It enabled surplus at a scale that allowed the city to function beyond immediate survival needs. And surplus is the foundation of complexity. With food stability secured, specialization deepened further. Warriors became more formally organized into structured ranks. Craftsmen refined production methods that supported both daily life and ceremonial systems. Merchants expanded trade networks deeper into regional economies. Religious leaders coordinated rituals that reinforced political legitimacy and social cohesion. And administrators managed the increasingly dense and interconnected urban system. Tenochtitlan was no longer a growing settlement. It was a coordinated civilization operating within a competitive environment. And coordination always produces hierarchy. As internal complexity increased, authority became more concentrated among those who controlled three essential domains: resources, military force, and religious legitimacy. These domains were not separate systems. They were interconnected pillars of power. Control resources, and you control survival. Control the military, and you control enforcement. Control religion, and you control meaning. Together, they formed the structural base upon which centralized authority was emerging. Externally, the Valley of Mexico remained a system defined by competition and instability. City-states continued to rise and fall through cycles of war, alliance, and shifting dominance. But what changed was how this system was understood. Conflict was no longer seen as isolated events. It was seen as continuous adjustment within a larger balance of power. Each victory created obligations. Each defeat created dependencies. And each shift in power altered the structure of the region. The Aztecs studied this dynamic with increasing sophistication. They began to understand that military strength alone was insufficient for long-term dominance. What mattered was the ability to convert conflict into lasting political structure. This understanding marked a critical turning point, because it transformed warfare from an end into a tool. At the same time, ideological cohesion within Aztec society remained essential to its stability. Their origin narrative, from Aztlan, guided by divine instruction, and culminating in the founding sign of the eagle on a cactus, remained central to identity. But it functioned as more than tradition. It functioned as interpretation, a framework for understanding reality itself. It explained their past. It justified their present. And it structured their future ambitions. In unstable environments, shared meaning becomes a stabilizing force stronger than physical conditions. Tenochtitlan itself continued to evolve in both structure and efficiency. Canals and causeways improved internal movement and external connectivity. Trade became more organized. Communication between districts became faster. And governance became more coordinated. The city was no longer expanding without direction. It was becoming internally synchronized. Externally, recognition of Aztec presence had become permanent and irreversible. Even opposing powers had to account for them in every strategic calculation. They were no longer outside the system. They were part of it. And once a society becomes part of a system, it begins to influence outcomes indirectly. It shapes expectations before decisions are made. It alters strategies before conflict begins. It changes the behavior of others without direct action. At this stage, the Aztecs were still not dominant. But they had crossed the final threshold of emergence. They were no longer developing in isolation. They were embedded within the structure of regional power itself. And embedded structures do not remain static. They either stabilize into control or transform the system they are part of. And at this point, the Valley of Mexico was no longer simply a collection of competing cities. It was becoming a field of forces. And within that field, one force was now strong enough that everything else had to move around it. For a long time, the Valley of Mexico functioned like a balanced system held together by tension. No single city fully controlled it. Power shifted in cycles. Alliances rose and collapsed. And every major city-state accepted one reality: survival depended on not allowing any one power to become too strong. But systems built on balance always contain the conditions for imbalance. And for the developing Aztec Empire, that imbalance began to form through a single, unavoidable truth. Tenochtitlan was no longer just one of many cities. It was becoming a center of gravity, not because it had fully conquered others, but because it had become structurally necessary to the region's politics. Surrounding powers had already adjusted their thinking. Some treated the Aztecs as partners, some as rivals, some as future threats, but none could ignore them. And that is the first stage of dominance, inevitability in calculation. At this stage, a major power in the region, Azcapotzalco, held significant influence over surrounding city-states. Its authority was not absolute, but it shaped the political environment through tribute relationships and military pressure. Smaller cities operated within its sphere of influence, maintaining fragile autonomy under larger control. Tenochtitlan existed inside this system. At first, this was simply another layer of political reality. But over time, it became a pressure point. Because systems of control depend on stability. And stability depends on balance between subordinate cities. The Aztecs were no longer a passive participant in this arrangement. They had grown too organized, too structured, and too strategically aware to remain static. Their internal systems, built on surplus agriculture, specialization, and coordination, made them increasingly efficient compared to many surrounding polities. This efficiency changed how they behaved. Not immediately in open conflict, but in confidence. And confidence is often the first visible sign of structural shift. Inside Tenochtitlan, society continued to tighten its internal organization. The agricultural base ensured that food production remained stable even under external pressure. That stability allowed specialization to deepen further. Military organization became more formalized, with clearer structures of training, and coordination. Religious authority became more central in legitimizing leadership decisions. Administrative roles became more important in managing both internal complexity and external relations. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply adapting to its environment. It was preparing to act within it. Externally, tensions across the Valley of Mexico increased gradually. Not through a single war, but through accumulated friction. As dominant powers like Azcapotzalco expanded influence, smaller cities began reassessing alliances and obligations. Tribute systems placed pressure on subordinate regions. Military campaigns enforced compliance, and political relationships became increasingly unstable. In this environment, flexibility mattered more than strength alone. And the Aztecs had learned flexibility through survival. They had already experienced marginalization, dependency, and negotiation under stronger powers. That history shaped their political intelligence. They understood systems of control from within, not as outsiders analyzing them, but as participants who had lived under them. And that distinction matters, because it changes strategy from theory to instinct. At this stage, the Aztecs began to move more deliberately within the regional system. They formed alliances where beneficial. They avoided direct confrontation where unnecessary. And they positioned themselves carefully within shifting political networks. But beneath this cautious behavior, something more significant was forming. A long-term awareness that the current balance of power was not permanent. Azcapotzalco's dominance, like all dominance in the Valley of Mexico, depended on continued control over a complex and unstable network of cities. And no network of that size remains stable indefinitely. The Aztecs observed this carefully. They did not yet challenge the system openly, but they were no longer simply surviving within it. They were studying its weaknesses. Inside Tenochtitlan, internal cohesion remained strong. Shared identity rooted in migration history and divine guidance continued to reinforce unity. This unity mattered increasingly as external pressure intensified. Because as regional systems become more competitive, internal coordination becomes a survival advantage. And the Aztecs had that advantage. Their city was more integrated. Their systems more organized. Their population more cohesive. And cohesion in a fragmented political environment is power waiting to be activated. By the end of this stage, the situation had shifted subtly but irreversibly. The Valley of Mexico was no longer a balanced system of equals. It was becoming a hierarchy under strain. Azcapotzalco at the top, subordinate cities beneath it, and one rising power inside, that structure beginning to operate differently from the rest. Not openly dominant, not yet in rebellion, but no longer passive. The conditions for transformation were now in place. And once those conditions exist, the system does not return to equilibrium. It moves forward. When a political system begins to lose equilibrium, it rarely collapses all at once. It shifts first subtly, then irreversibly. For the developing Aztec Empire, this shift was now becoming visible in the wider structure of the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply operating within a regional hierarchy. It was beginning to exist as a separate trajectory inside that hierarchy. And that is where systems begin to break. The dominant regional power structure, centered around Azcapotzalco, still maintained authority through tribute, military pressure, and political influence over subordinate city-states. On the surface, the system still appeared stable. Cities still paid tribute. Alliances still functioned. and political order still held. But underneath, tension was accumulating. Because stability built on dominance requires constant reinforcement. And constant reinforcement is never sustainable forever. Tenochtitlan, at this stage, had reached a level of internal strength that made it fundamentally different from many of its neighbors. Its agricultural base remained stable through chinampa production. Its population continued to grow within a structured urban environment. Its social organization had become increasingly coordinated across military, religious, and administrative systems. And its internal cohesion, rooted in shared origin, identity, and purpose, remained unusually strong. This combination created something important: resilience under pressure. While many city-states struggled to balance tribute demands with internal stability, Tenochtitlan had developed the ability to absorb pressure without breaking. And systems that absorb pressure rather than collapse under it behave differently over time. They accumulate capacity. Externally, the regional political order continued to rely on the assumption that Azcapotzalco's dominance would remain uncontested. But that assumption was beginning to weaken. Because subordinate cities were no longer static. They were adapting. Some were quietly seeking alternatives. Others were reassessing alliances. And a few were beginning to recognize that the current system might not be permanent. Tenochtitlan existed at the center of this changing perception. Not as an open challenger, but as a growing alternative model of organization. A city that was becoming increasingly efficient, increasingly structured, and increasingly capable of independent action. Inside the city, the same forces that had driven earlier development now intensified. Surplus production from chinampa agriculture continued to sustain population growth and specialization. Military organization became more disciplined, reflecting the need for coordinated defense and potential expansion. Religious authority continued to reinforce legitimacy, ensuring that political structure remained socially stable. And administrative systems became more essential as urban complexity increased. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply developing systems. It was refining them. Externally, however, the regional system was beginning to strain. Azcapotzalco's dominance required constant enforcement. Tribute relationships required monitoring. Military campaigns required ongoing attention. And political alliances required continuous management. This created structural pressure at the center of power. Because no dominant system can expand indefinitely without increasing internal strain. And as strain increases, control becomes more expensive. The Aztecs observed this dynamic carefully. They understood that power is not only about strength. It is about sustainability. And systems that become unsustainable eventually force openings for change. At this stage, Tenochtitlan was no longer simply adapting to regional politics. It was positioning itself within the weaknesses of that politics. Not through direct confrontation, but through preparation. Internally strengthening its capacity while externally remaining flexible. This dual strategy created a unique position within the Valley of Mexico. A city that was part of the system, but not fully constrained by it. And systems that contain partially independent components are inherently unstable. Because independence within dependence creates tension. By the end of this stage, the regional structure had reached a critical point. The appearance of stability remained, but the conditions beneath it had changed. Azcapotzalco still appeared dominant, but its dominance now required increasing effort to maintain. And Tenochtitlan was no longer simply growing within that system. It was becoming the point at which the system would eventually change direction. Not through sudden collapse, but through accumulated transformation. And once that process begins, the structure does not return to what it was. It becomes something else entirely. When a system built on dominance begins to fail, it rarely announces it. It first shows it in hesitation, in delay, in small inconsistencies that no single city can fully explain. For the developing Aztec Empire, this was the moment the Valley of Mexico began to shift from tension into rupture. The dominance of Azcapotzalco still appeared intact on the surface. Tribute still flowed. Political structures still functioned. And the hierarchy of city-states still seemed to hold. But the foundation beneath it was no longer stable. Because what had once been a system of control was now becoming a system of strain. Every enforced tribute created resentment. Every military campaign stretched resources further. Every alliance required more maintenance than the last. And systems under constant strain do not remain unchanged. They fracture along their weakest points. Inside Tenochtitlan, the changes were more subtle but more important. The city was no longer operating as a reactive participant in the system. It was now operating as a calculating one. Its internal structure had reached a level of cohesion that many surrounding cities lacked. Agricultural surplus remained stable. Population growth continued in controlled expansion. Labor specialization had become deeply embedded across society. And coordination between military, religious, and administrative systems had become increasingly efficient. This mattered because efficiency changes political behavior. A city that can act with coordination can also act with timing. And timing is what determines outcomes in unstable systems. Externally, pressure on Azcapotzalco's network of control began to increase. Subordinate cities, long held in fragile compliance, started to reassess their position. Some began delaying tribute. Others quietly shifted alliances. A few began exploring alternatives that had previously seemed unthinkable. Not rebellion yet, but drift. And drift is the beginning of structural collapse. The Aztecs observed this carefully. They did not rush into action. They rarely did at this stage. Instead, they studied patterns of weakening authority. They watched how dominant systems responded when compliance decreased. And they learned a crucial lesson. Power is not lost in a single defeat. It is lost when obedience becomes optional. Inside Tenochtitlan, leadership began to understand something increasingly important. The regional system was no longer simply unstable. It was transitioning. And transitions create opportunities that stable systems never allow. For the first time, the Aztecs were not just preparing within a system. They were preparing for a system to change. And that distinction matters more than anything that came before it. Because preparation for stability produces survival. But preparation for transition produces expansion. By this stage, the Valley of Mexico was no longer a balanced hierarchy. It was becoming a field of competing directions. Azcapotzalco still stood at the center. But its control no longer felt absolute. And when control stops feeling absolute, it stops being absolute. Tenochtitlan had not yet acted. But it no longer needed to rush. Because the system around it was already beginning to move. And when a system moves on its own, the question is no longer whether change will happen. It is who will define it when it does. When a political system begins to break, the most important changes are not the loud ones. They are the adjustments no one announces. For the developing Aztec Empire, the Valley of Mexico had now entered that phase. Azcapotzalco still existed as the dominant force in the region. Its authority had not yet vanished. Its tribute networks still functioned, and its influence still shaped political decisions across multiple city-states. But dominance is not just control. It is the ability to prevent alternatives from forming. And that ability was weakening. Inside the system, small fractures were spreading. City-states that once complied without hesitation began delaying obligations. Others started shifting diplomatic attention toward alternative partners. And a few began quietly testing whether Azcapotzalco's responses were still as strong as before. Each of these actions, on its own, was minor. Together, they signaled something far more important. The system was no longer enforcing itself automatically. And when enforcement becomes inconsistent, structure begins to dissolve. Inside Tenochtitlan, the change was not chaos. It was clarity. The city's internal organization had reached a level of coordination that allowed it to respond to external shifts with precision rather than panic. Agricultural production from Chinampas remained stable, ensuring that food supply was not disrupted even as regional instability increased. Population growth continued, but within manageable limits. And specialization across society had become deeply embedded. Warriors trained in structured formations. Craftsmen produced goods that supported both daily life and political ritual. Merchants expanded exchange routes, strengthening economic links beyond immediate neighbors. Religious institutions reinforced unity through consistent ceremonial structure. And administrative systems coordinated the increasing complexity of urban governance. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply growing. It was consolidating capability. Externally, the weakening of Azcapotzalco's control began to produce visible consequences. Some subordinate cities began acting independently in small but meaningful ways. Others re-evaluated old alliances that had once seemed permanent. And a few began positioning themselves for a future in which the current hierarchy no longer existed. This was not yet rebellion. It was reorientation. And reorientation is the first stage of systemic replacement. The Aztecs observed these changes with increasing focus. They did not interpret them as isolated events. They saw them as signals, indicators that the regional system was no longer stable enough to enforce its own structure consistently. And in such conditions, timing becomes more important than strength. Because early positioning in a collapsing system determines who shapes what comes next. Within Tenochtitlan, leadership began to understand that the city was no longer operating inside a fixed hierarchy. It was operating inside a changing one. And changing hierarchies reward different behaviors than stable ones. In stable systems, survival depends on compliance. In unstable systems, survival depends on adaptability. But in transitioning systems, survival depends on preparation. And preparation requires patience. The Aztecs did not rush. They watched. They learned. They strengthened internal cohesion while maintaining external awareness. And they waited for the system to move further out of balance. Azcapotzalco, meanwhile, still acted as though its authority remained unquestioned. But maintaining authority now required increasing effort. Mori enforcement. Mori intervention. Mori resources spent simply holding the structure together. And that is one of the most important signals in political history. When a dominant power must work harder just to remain dominant, it is already losing control of the system it depends on. By the end of this stage, the Valley of Mexico was no longer a stable hierarchy. It was a contested transition zone. Old structures still existed, but they no longer defined outcomes with certainty. And emerging powers no longer behaved like subordinate actors. They behaved like future architects of the system. Tenochtitlan had not yet changed the order, but it had fully adapted to the moment when change became inevitable. And in historical systems, that position is often the most powerful one of all. When a dominant system begins to fail, it does not collapse evenly. It weakens in specific places first, and those weak points decide everything that follows. For the developing Aztec Empire, the Valley of Mexico had now reached that stage of uneven failure. Azcapotzalco still appeared powerful. It still demanded tribute. It still influenced political decisions across the region. And it still maintained the image of dominance. But image and control are not the same thing. Control depends on consistent enforcement. And enforcement was becoming less reliable. Inside the system, city-states began to behave differently. Some delayed tribute without immediate consequence. Others shifted alliances more openly than before. And a few began testing how far they could act independently before triggering retaliation. Each individual action was small, but together they revealed a deeper truth. The system no longer responded with certainty, and uncertainty is where authority begins to break. Inside Tenochtitlan, awareness of this shift was now fully developed. The city was no longer interpreting events as isolated political changes. It was interpreting them as structural transformation. Agricultural stability from Chinampas ensured that internal pressure remained low even as external instability increased. This gave the city something most others did not have: time. And time in unstable systems becomes a strategic advantage. Social organization within Tenochtitlan had matured further. Warriors were no longer loosely organized groups, but structured forces with training discipline. Craft production supported both economic exchange and ceremonial life. Trade networks extended influence beyond immediate regional boundaries. Religious systems reinforced internal cohesion and political legitimacy. And administrative coordination allowed the city to function as a unified structure rather than fragmented groups. Tenochtitlan was now operating as a fully integrated system. Not just a city reacting to pressure, but a system capable of deliberate action. Externally, Azcapotzalco's authority began to show visible strain. Its dominance still existed in form, but not in consistency. Some regions complied fully. Others complied partially. And others began to resist in subtle ways that avoided immediate retaliation. This fragmentation was critical, because dominance is not destroyed by direct confrontation alone. It is destroyed when uniform response becomes impossible. The Aztecs observed this carefully. They did not yet move openly against the system, but they no longer treated it as stable. Instead, they began to treat it as temporary. And that shift in perception is one of the most important turning points in political development. Because once a system is seen as temporary, it is no longer treated as absolute. Within Tenochtitlan, leadership increasingly understood that the regional structure was entering a final phase of instability. Not collapse in a single moment, but breakdown through accumulated inconsistency. And in such a phase, the most important factor is not strength alone. It is positioning. Where a city places itself before the final shift determines what role it will play after it. Azcapotzalco still attempted to maintain control through existing structures. But every effort required more resources than before. And every intervention produced diminishing returns. This is the sign of a system that is no longer self-sustaining. It must constantly push against change simply to remain in place. And systems that must constantly resist change are already in motion toward it. By this stage, Tenochtitlan had become something different from all other cities in the region. It was no longer defined by its position in the hierarchy. It was defined by its readiness for what comes after the hierarchy. And that is the moment when a rising power stops being a participant in history and starts becoming its direction. There is always a final moment in collapsing political systems when everything still appears intact, but nothing actually is. For the developing Aztec Empire, the Valley of Mexico had now entered that exact condition. Azcapotzalco still functioned as the dominant power. Tribute still moved through its networks. Political structures still existed on paper and tradition. And most cities still behaved as if the old order remained fully in place. But beneath that surface, the system had already changed. The illusion of control only lasts until enough participants stop believing in it. And that threshold had now been crossed. Across the region, city-states began acting with increasing independence. Some reduced tribute without immediate consequence. Others openly shifted alliances, testing new political alignments. And a few began coordinating quietly with one another outside the influence of Azcapotzalco. This was no longer simple instability. It was structural fragmentation. Inside Tenochtitlan, the change was not confusion, it was acceleration. The city's internal systems were now strong enough to interpret instability as opportunity rather than threat. Agricultural production from Chinampas remained stable, ensuring that population growth and urban function continued without disruption. This stability created a rare advantage in a collapsing regional system, continuity. While others adjusted reactively, Tenochtitlan could plan. Labor specialization deepened further. Military organization became more disciplined and structured, reflecting the need for coordinated strength in a shifting environment. Craft production supported both economic exchange and political expression. Religious systems reinforced unity at a time when external uncertainty was increasing. And administrative coordination ensured that decisions could be made and executed without fragmentation. Tenochtitlan was no longer just resilient. It was coherent. Externally, Azcapotzalco's authority began to fracture in visible ways. Some subordinate regions still complied fully out of habit or caution. Others complied inconsistently, delaying or negotiating obligations. And others began to act independently, no longer waiting for approval. This inconsistency was the true signal of collapse. Because power is not lost when it is challenged. It is lost when it is no longer consistently obeyed. The Aztecs observed this shift with increasing clarity. They no longer treated the regional system as something stable or permanent. They treated it as something entering its final phase of reorganization. And in such phases, timing determines survival more than strength. Move too early, and you are crushed by remaining authority. Move too late, and you inherit nothing. But move correctly, and you shape what comes next. Within Tenochtitlan, leadership now understood that the Valley of Mexico was no longer governed by a stable hierarchy. It was governed by momentum. And momentum always moves toward a new equilibrium once the old one fails. Azcapotzalco still attempted to enforce control. But enforcement now required greater force for smaller results. And that is one of the clearest signs of systemic exhaustion. Every action costs more. Every response is weaker. Every correction produces less stability than before. By this stage, Tenochtitlan had fully transitioned from a subordinate city into a strategic actor preparing for structural change. It was no longer reacting to the system. It was anticipating its replacement. And once a society reaches that level of awareness, it is no longer inside the existing order in the same way. It is already part of the next one forming beneath it. The Valley of Mexico was now split between two realities. The official structure still existed, but the functional structure was dissolving. And between those two layers, a new order was beginning to form. Quietly, relentlessly, and without needing permission from the one it was replacing.